Hello, good afternoon. My name is Erik Verstraat. I am president of the Fiber to the Home Council Europe. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, which is called Accelerate Fiber Broadband Monetization. It is a webinar that is organized by Nokia. First, a few words around the Fiber to the Home Council Europe. We are an industry association founded in 2004. With a mission to advance ubiquitous full fiber-based connectivity to the whole of Europe. We have more than 150 member companies, which is vendors, operators, and investors. And our activities include expert advice to policymakers and regulators, studies and reports, networking platform available for all members and non-members, and an annual FTTH conference where you see a picture here. Our last one was in last May in Vienna. The Fiber to the Home Council organizes as well what we call sponsored webinars, and these are a series of fiber industry webinars, providing a focused audience specifically on fiber, of industry specialists and stakeholders. And it is promoted by the highly respected industry association that we are. Some practical information before we start and dive into the content. The webinar will be recorded and is accessible digitally after the session. Given we have received your consent, you will be notified about future FTTH Council Europe webinar series events. And you may pose your questions during the webinar in the question section you have here on the platform. And shall the time permit it, then the moderator, which the role I'm playing here, will share your questions with the speakers. Okay. So that being said, I would like to present you the topics of this session. So Accelerate Fiber Broadband Monetization is the title. Merely we talk about advances in fiber technology enabling new services and resulting in more revenue streams. And the bulk of the presentation will be around how to offer, promote, drive adoption, and accelerate monetization of fiber broadband. It will be all around best practices from expert speakers of this session that you see, both Benoit and myself. The two speakers, quickly on myself, I'm president of the Fiber to the Home Council Europe, but within my Nokia job, I'm director strategic marketing of the Fixed Networks division. We are delighted to have Benoit here with us. Benoit Fulton was active in this field for more than a decade. He came back after 10 years in Asia back to Europe and is now working for Plum Consulting, and we are very happy that he will share his expertise with us a bit later in this presentation. Welcome, Benoit. Well, the title of the presentation is Accelerate Fiber Broadband Monetization. Now, I would not be the president of the Fiber to the Home Council Europe if I would not say that fiber is there for everything, not only to the home, but in fact to all sorts of segments that we discover in the market today. It is clear, as setting the scene, that fiber is the future, and network providers are investing. Fiber is the fastest growing access technology. We see via analysts that today 60% of all fixed broadband is fiber, and we expect 70% in a couple of years from now. It is the most future-proof and greenest technology, and above all, once the outside plant is deployed, you do not need to touch again that outside plant. You can move ahead and move ahead and move ahead. So these elements are very clear in the market. I don't have to convince anyone on this one. But we start to think differently about fiber broadband. We see this evolution of these passive optical network PON technologies, as we call them, from GPON to XGS-PON to 25 gig and later 50 gig and 100 gig, which gives us a lot of other opportunities and also other revenues, potential revenues that we can get on the network. That's why we state that it is one single infrastructure to connect everything and everyone. And fiber infrastructure is indeed there for more than only residential. As I said at the beginning, you invest once and you monetize again and again and again. And it starts, of course, with residential broadband, and that, of course, reaches the bulk of your consumers in the market. But on that same infrastructure, you can also offer business services. And there with fiber, you can have dedicated internet connectivity, but we more and more now moving from point-to-point fiber to also point-to-multipoint type of fiber connectivity to more business broadband, which is not having necessarily the same SLA as the pure point-to-point, but with decent and a very acceptable in the market type of SLA and quality of service. You can go to wholesale. You can offer connectivity to ISPs over your network. You can also wholesale to enterprises, for instance. You can cover mobile transport over that same fiber infrastructure, which is happening today already in a lot of cases, but will happen more and more. Cloud gaming, immersive entertainment, all these things where you need more and more, let's say, symmetrical, latency sensitive type of traffic. Also, that traffic can be covered over your fiber infrastructure. Not to even talk about all the smart city type of applications you could ever imagine. I heard even yesterday that Chorus New Zealand, for instance, will do the monitoring over CCTV with all their rail transport road network, because they do not think that wireless is reliable enough. No, they do it with fiber in the whole city of Auckland, for instance. Now, that being said, fiber is there for more than only residential. But if you think about the residential mindset, then you say we are deploying GPON. And of course, with GPON, you see that the first years you have an investment to be made. And then you see that after something like 7 years, you start to be positive on your cumulative discounted cash flow. But as I said, there are new PON technologies that can, like 10G PON, for instance, XGS PON, that gives you much more possibilities and opportunities to have new revenues and new services, which gives you a little additional investment at the beginning, but then brings forward the number of years in which you can get on top of the bar and being positive on your return on investment. You can even, with a slight even additional improvement, with 25 gig PON, for instance, say that you have a higher cash flow and your break-even moves to 5 years instead of 7 years. This is, of course, a generic case. Every business case is different, but you can clearly see the main lines of that economical analysis. One single fiber infrastructure for all services and one converged network, that we all know. We all believe that, and we all with that. You see that more revenues, lower TCO. If you use one fiber network, a converged network, all that is very clear. But you see that there are now a lot more, by this PON evolution, a lot more possibilities, a lot more opportunities, and a lot more network parameters. There is high capacity. You can move, as I said, from GPON to XGS PON to 25 gig PON. The opportunity to have low latency, so sub-millisecond latency, not even to talk about even lower if you talk about 5G front haul type of solutions, for instance. Remember, mobile transport also over fiber. Latency becomes very important. The automation as well. With the move to software-defined access networks, you're going to decouple, in fact, software and hardware from each other, make it more simple, make it much more automated, move to zero-touch provisioning and these kind of things. The mission-critical aspect, not even to forget. We tend to link it to healthcare and emergency and typical very sensitive business type of applications. But now, after the COVID pandemic, every house starts to be, in fact, a mission-critical connectivity, because you work from home, you live at home, so that importance of that connectivity at home starts to be of utmost importance more and more. And then the green aspect, power consumption, is also a very important aspect. The sustainability of fiber access networks is proven that it's far better than with other access networks, network technologies. And we see that the power consumption, if you move to one fiber access network, in fact, goes 7 or 10 times lower than if you would combine all these different networks. So I think it's clear that one fiber infrastructure with all these new PON technologies on top of it, creating lots of opportunities for monetizing. And at the end, network providers are not in the network for only charity. They are in the network there to gain money, to create revenue, and to be successful there. And that's why we look very carefully into fiber strategies for monetization. First of all, you need to enhance your consumer services. It's what we call gigabit monetization, and I come to that in a minute, but also to enlarge the service portfolio. Not only residential, as I said, business, wholesale, mobile, and all the 4.0 industry type of applications you see coming up there. So there are two axes we see that it's clearly moving into. What we would like to focus now on is on the first part, enhancing the consumer services, because there's still a lot to gain as well. And today, for instance, we see that most of the service providers, they have gigabit offers in their portfolio. Now, Benoit, over to you. Can we say that the fixed broadband market is in the era of gigabit now today?
Not exactly, because it's true that something like 60% of service providers worldwide now offer gigabit connectivity. But if you start drilling down and looking at exactly how many people are subscribing, the number is much, much lower. Now, very few operators actually officially report that number, but from various conversations that I've had with service providers around the world, the number that I come around is 15 to 20%. So in other words, when there is a gigabit offer available on a network, on average, only 15 to 20% of consumers actually subscribe to that gigabit offer. And this to me is a very important finding, because gigabit has been on the market for 15 years now. I mean, the earliest operators who launched gigabit were in a 2005, 2006 era. Now, of course, they were trailblazers at the time, but it's a little concerning to me that we still have such a low percentage of customers who actually subscribe to gigabit.
And why aren't they pushing then for gigabit? Why aren't they doing that?
Well, there's a number of possible reasons. I think, first of all, because they don't really want to, or at least they don't implement strategies that would lead to that goal. There are exceptions, of course, and in fact, there are a few operators that we studied that only have gigabit offers or more. So obviously, they have 100% take-up rate on gigabit. But for the most part, you don't see a concerted strategy to upsell customers to gigabit. But beyond that, there are also, I think, some old ways of doing things that are still prevalent and are not fully adapted to the challenges of the upsell. So for example, a lot of operators, and I'll come back to that in a minute, a lot of operators have a lot of offers, way too many offers. And that creates customer confusion, because when you're going to subscribe, you don't really know the difference between all of this. And also it creates caution. So customers are a little more reluctant to go forward, because they feel like operators are trying to hide something, or maybe not deliver as good as they're saying they will. So all of that is an issue. Pricing, of course, is an issue as well. In many, many offers, we saw on the previous slide that a lot of operators only have speeds up to a gigabit. In many, many offers, gigabit is the highest speed tier, and it's packaged as a premium offer. So the price differential is very high. And one thing I heard from a number of operators, which I find very ironic, is this fear of tomorrow's upsell. So this idea that basically, if I push all my customers to gigabit today, what am I going to sell them tomorrow? And to me, that's a very short-term view on the market. We know that XGS-PON is being deployed today. We know that 25G-PON is ready for deployment, and it will be deployed by some operators in the next few years. So purely in terms of speed, there is no reason why customers would say, well, I've got a gigabit, I'll never go beyond. In fact, I did a study 10 years ago for the council on the Swedish market, and we asked gigabit customers back then if they were willing to purchase higher speed tiers, which didn't exist at the time. And 40% of gigabit customers were saying, I want to buy a higher speed tier. So there's no reason to fear this, but it's in the marketing of a lot of operators, there's this element of what am I going to sell tomorrow? And so rather than sell today, I protect myself by not selling today, which to me is an absurd proposition.
Yeah, I understand. But it is essentially then a price issue, in fact.
Well, that would be probably the first and biggest issue. But the price element itself is actually driven by a number of things. And one of those is the segmentation. So anyone who's been to marketing school, as I have, knows that you're drilled in this marketing theory that an optimal segmentation is how you make the most revenue out of a given market. And so there is kind of an urge in marketing teams to segment as far as they can. But I think there is such a thing as too much segmentation, because when consumers no longer perceive the difference between two offers, then you've gone too far in the segmentation. And here we're talking about broadband speeds, and it's quite clear to me that while you will perceive a difference as a user if you switch from 100 meg to a gig, you might not perceive a difference if you switch from 500 to a gig or from 100 to 200. And so having an excessive number of speed tiers actually muddies the water entirely. And consumers then end up saying, well, maybe what I have is good enough. I'm not sure I need more, because they don't see what they're going to get from these higher speed tiers. So what we see here, for example, is that on average, service providers offer a little over 3 fiber broadband plans, but that's the average, and that includes companies, as I mentioned, who only have 1 speed tier. So in reality, what we're looking at is closer to 4 on average, and that's a little bit higher for incumbent operators who tend to segment more. And we've seen in our sample that we've studied, we've seen operators with up to 6 different speed plans between 100 and a gig. And that to me is crazy, because not only does it mean the consumers no longer see the difference, but it also means that you have to manage space in your pricing plan for all of these different plans. And that means that mathematically that pushes up the gigabit to prices that are simply too high.
Okay.
So like, what we've looked at here is we've looked at the difference between the entry-level fiber offer, which is usually 100 meg, but in some instances can be a little lower than that, and the gigabit plan. And what we see is that on average, the price difference is 45%. So a gigabit on average is 45% more expensive than 100 meg. Right? With incumbents, again, that gap is a little higher, so it tends to be 50%. But in our sample, and we looked at about 25 different operators, in our sample, we have 4 operators where the price gap is 100%. So the gigabit cost is double the 100 meg. And that price gap is clearly too high. And you can see here on the left on that graph, you can see the direct impact of the number of plans on the gap in pricing. Basically, if you have 1 or 2 plans, your price gap is around 20%. If you have more than that, your price gap is around 50 to 60%. Now, I've heard marketing people within service operators say, but I'm delivering 10 times the speed. So in theory, I could ask for 10 times the price. But that's an absurd proposition, because what the consumer is buying is not the speed itself. It's everything that speed enables. And also, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but we have to remember that once you've actually built your fiber network, upgrading a customer from 100 meg to a gig has virtually 0 cost attached to it. And so we have here a classic case of a price that becomes completely decorrelated from its cost base, and that creates a disincentive for consumers to migrate.
Sure, I understand. So this is how service providers have segmented, in fact, and priced their offerings. maybe it's not in their interest to then upsell to gigabit, for instance, or is it?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, is that they don't necessarily think that it is. But I think that it is. I think it's in their interest for one very simple reason, which is based on what I said earlier, which is that the cost to upsell to gigabit is virtually zero. Basically, it's a tiny little bit more of energy cost each month, and it's a tiny little bit more of transit cost each month. We're talking literally cents per subscriber per month. Now, historically, in the initial deployments, a lot of ONTs were not gigabit compatible. So you also had to upgrade the ONT. But now every ONT that's out on the market is gigabit compatible. So that's no longer a hurdle. So basically, what I see in the market is that a lot of the operators see this as premium. So they're going to put a high ARPU uplift, but address a small part of the customer base, where in fact, they could have a small ARPU uplift and upsell to a large part of the customer base. Now, in terms of revenue, that would look roughly the same. But the thing is that in order to build these premium gigabit offers, they pack in a lot of additional services that actually cost either to produce or to buy. So for example, if you look around at the premium gigabit offers of a lot of operators, you'll have Netflix included, Disney Plus included, some IPTV solutions. All of these things are actually eating into your margin. So in revenue terms, a naked gigabit offer that would be, 20% more expensive than your 100 meg offer versus a premium offer that would be 50% more expensive. Actually, you would, if you market the gigabit offer properly, the naked gigabit offer properly, you would be generating pure additional margin. Whereas in the premium case, not only are you addressing a much smaller part of your customer base, but you're actually not generating full margin because you have all these additional services that you have to pay for. The other thing, of course, is that if you're not aggressive on gigabit, someone else will be, right? So this is the story of DSL in France, right? When Free came on the market, they said, you will have the highest speed we can offer no matter what. And when they started deploying fiber, they did the same. So basically, everyone is competing against a higher speed offer that's at the same price or even cheaper. Now, maybe that's not the case in your market, but it could very well become that. Anyone who's deploying XGS-PON today is going to be thinking, okay, so if I can now have gigabit as the base speed for my customers, how do I articulate a market strategy around that to actually acquire new consumers, new customers? So if you're not doing it, someone else will. And it's a bad thing in any market to be the second one to launch what's perceived as an innovation by the consumers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now we talk, of course, about retail, but do we see the same trends if we look to the wholesale market, for instance?
So, not exactly. It's quite interesting. A few of the wholesalers are replicating basically what we're seeing on the retail side, on the wholesale side. But there are exceptions, and there are actually quite a few exceptions. And this is something I found very interesting doing this research, right? So, on average, a wholesale offer will be 30 to 50% below retail price, which is what we see as the kind of average in the market. It varies a lot between markets and depending on the circumstances, but essentially that holds true, right? But half of the wholesalers that we looked into only offer one speed tier, or in fact, they don't offer one speed tier, they offer one price. So they price the circuit, even though it's bitstream that they sell, not passive fiber. They price the circuit at the same price no matter what speed you want. In fact, one of the service providers, the wholesalers that we spoke to, very interestingly said, we will build into the system whatever speed tiers our retail customers want. So they have the full freedom of saying, this is exactly how I want to tailor my offer. In other words, the wholesaler does not impose his his segmentation onto his retailers in this particular instance. But others basically say, well, we offer speeds up to 1 gigabit and the price is the same no matter what speed you decide to subscribe to. And I think that's an interesting trend because it highlights one element that I find very interesting, which is there's a complexity systems-wise in enabling a lot of different wholesale products. And so basically what these wholesalers are saying is that complexity is not worth it in terms of the revenues that it will, the extra revenues it will generate. It's just not worth it. And so we might as well have a single price. I think that's an interesting trend, and hopefully it highlights to their retail customers that they don't have to segment to excess like they're often doing today. Now, as I said, there are exceptions. We also have in the sample a wholesaler that has 16 different speed tiers in their wholesale offer, which is insane. But you know, so not everyone is ahead of the curve in this.
Indeed, and it depends a bit on market by market, of course. Indeed, yeah.
Yes.
But maybe service providers are more focused on generating additional revenue from value-added services, for instance, because we talk about internet and data connectivity, but value-added services come in the game as well.
So what we did for this piece of work is we reviewed the complete set of services from every single one of the providers we looked into. And if you look at the graph here on the left, it looks like there's a lot of services on offer. But actually, on average, a given operator only offers 4 additional services to the broadband offer, which is quite low. And most of these services are actually not included in the broadband packages. Or sometimes they're included only in the premium package. But that suggests to me that these services are there for adoption more than they are for revenue generation. In other words, you need to have these services in your package to attract consumers, but you don't expect that they will generate a lot of revenue. So without having looked at the numbers, it suggests to me that if the strategy is to say, well, we don't necessarily want our customers on higher speed tiers because we're happy selling them additional services, it doesn't look to me from examining the offers like that is particularly successful either. Now, there's one interesting shift though from a few years ago, and that is that we're clearly seeing now that IPTV is dying. So, I mean, the be all and end all of fiber offers a decade ago was you have to offer your own TV platform because that's the differentiator that's going to make people go from their DSL to the fiber offer. 10 years on, basically streaming is the name of the game, and a lot of the operators actually embed streaming TV content in their offers or offer them as options. So they act effectively as distributors to the Disney Pluses, Hulus, HBOs, and Netflixes of this world. Which is a little bit ironic, if I may, because we hear the operators complaining all the time that these large platforms are eating their lunch by using their network, but at the same time, they're the ones who are actually pushing these products to the end consumer, which I found to be quite paradoxical. And like similarly, we hear a lot about gaming offers or gaming segments, tailoring the broadband experience for gamers, because I mean, on paper that makes sense. Gamers are a lot more sensitive to specific latency issues, things that basically your average consumer might not be so worried about. They're going to be more aware of. I'm sure everyone's heard this story that 10 years ago online players were convinced that the Swedes were the best in the world and they didn't want to play them. And actually the reality was the Swedes had better broadband, so their latency was lower, so they always reacted faster when you were on a shooting game, for example. So, for sure that's a segment where there's value to be extracted, but actually only 3 operators in the entire sample have gaming packages. And when you look at what these packages are, 2 out of 3 are actually just embedded Microsoft Xbox 360. So you feel like there's some potential there, but it's not really being addressed in any meaningful way. So the only services where I think they show future potential, and I think when I saw them, they tended to be packaged in a relatively intelligent way, even though they are partnership offerings, were home security and home automation services, particularly around home security. Home automation sometimes is also just devices and not actually an operated service. But it gave me the impression, to be honest, that there's been a lot of talk these last few years about innovative services on the service provider side, but there's not a lot of reality to it right now. So clearly, to me, that's not where the revenue generation is coming, at least today.
Indeed, I fully understand. So it's very, yes, it's very spread out. I fully understand. But as sales happen more and more online, let's move to that promotional aspect. How do you see that service providers are using online tools to channel these customers to Gigabit, for instance? How do you see that?
I was very surprised, to be honest, at how clunky the online channels were. I mean, if you anticipate that basically phone call-ins plus online is going to be 90% of your sales, which I think is true today in most places, then you want those to be easy to understand, streamlined, clear, and for the most part, they're not. You struggle to find the offers. Often fixed and mobile are mixed together, so it's very hard to understand exactly what you are talking about. Even harder when you throw Wi-Fi into the mix and all of that, because it's presented as wireless, and it's just very hard to understand in general what you would be buying. And then you add to that the large number of packages, and it becomes even harder to understand, because the packages are not just different speeds, there are different sets of services attached to them as well. And in some cases, the same services, but it's free in the premium package, and you have to pay for it in the non-premium package. And often these services also have options. So for example, just your Wi-Fi extension thing, right? Depending on your number of devices, not going to be the same price. It's really, really complicated to actually know what you're buying. And I mean, I consider myself, a telecom marketing expert, and sometimes I was struggling to see if, things as simple as, voice over IP were included or not included, or even available. And, like you see a poster, an advert that has someone with a phone, so you might assume that voice is included, but then when you look at the actual detail of the offer, it's mentioned nowhere. And it's only finally by clicking on a contract and you find a line number 565 that you see that there is a VoIP service. So I really think actually that there's a huge potential for efficiency in these online channels that hasn't been tapped into yet. And that, combined with a clear strategy, could be a real way to accelerate the monetization, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. So the promotional tools.
Well, yeah. So I mean, obviously, advertising is a big thing. I won't spend too much time on that, but essentially, what we see is that depending on where the market is when it comes to fiber, the advertising is very different, right? So in the early stages, you want people to become aware of fiber. So all of your advertising is going to be on, kind of presenting the fiber as a product. So there's lots of lights in these adverts. There's lots of technology elements, and then pushing the message that it's the fast broadband, etc. But these are relatively simple, kind of educational adverts. We don't see them in Western Europe very much anymore, but obviously we see them in other markets where fiber isn't quite so prevalent. Then there's a middle section where everybody's fighting to acquire customers, and then it's more about performance. So you're going to be, hearing words like power and everywhere and gigabit and future and speed and stuff like that. And then once the market is kind of mature and settled, it becomes more about lifestyle. So then you see, things like working from home, you see families represented, a lot of emphasis on customer service. So it's not so much about the performance anymore. It's more about the ease of use and the
Yes.
ease of contract, etc. Now, the second aspect of the marketing or kind of promotional side, of course, is on the price. And so here we see basically half of our sample have contract duration promotion. So if you commit to a year or more, you get discounts. And essentially, what we see is that the biggest benefit actually is on 1-year contract generally, because you get about a third off of your entire year's cost on a 1-year contract. And interestingly enough, those that do 2-year contracts, you also get a third of a year off. So you're not getting, obviously they're not offering 1 or 2-year contracts. They're offering one or the other. But when they're offering 2-year contracts, it's not as beneficial usually. And then there was one exception, someone who offered a 3-year contract. And basically, 3-year contract, you had 1 year free, which is the same as having 30% off a 1-year contract, but you'd be locked in for 3 years. But that's really the only promotional tool that we saw. There's a few instances of devices being given away. So for example, a Wi-Fi repeater would be given away if you contracted for a year or stuff like that. But essentially, that's really it. So not a huge amount of innovation there either, I felt.
Okay, I understand. So in fact, if we summarize that, what could service providers indeed do to truly embrace the gigabit era, in fact, today, as a sort of conclusion?
So I mean, hopefully I've managed to convey the fact that I think it's in their interests to actually have a dedicated strategy to push customers towards gigabit, or to establish gigabit as kind of a baseline in terms of the speeds that they offer. In order to do that, I think the first thing, most important thing maybe, is they have to rationalize and reduce the number of packages. So they have to recreate differentiation, which will have two beneficial effects. That consumers will perceive the difference, and also that it will mathematically flatten the price curve and reduce these huge gaps in pricing that basically position gigabit as premium, whereas there's no cost reason to actually do that, at least not in those proportions. Then the other thing is that, and this is just a common marketing issue in any market, right, is if you have a set of progressively more performing products, then the one that's at the end of the line, the most effective product, will always be kind of perceived as premium by the consumers anyway. So one way to address that is actually to launch offers beyond a gigabit, which with the implementation of XGS-PON in networks now becomes actually a very feasible possibility. And in fact, one of the interesting findings in our analysis is that service providers who offer speeds above a gigabit actually have lower price gaps between 100 and a gig, because the premium has now shifted to 2 or 5 or 10 or 8, well, technically. So I think that's also an important element, and it's also an important element in terms of image, because just in the same way that the first operators to launch gigabit in any given market actually benefited from an image point of view that, and acquired consumers from their competitors, maybe not at gigabit speeds, but basically it made their network look like the most performing, the most effective network. And I think that's another benefit of launching speeds beyond a gigabit now. But in order to benefit from that, you have to be the first one to do it, because if everybody's doing it at the same time, no one benefits. Exactly. And then this last point, which is a very practical point, is yeah, these online channels need to be worked at. The user experience is really atrocious, and so I think the service providers need to maybe take a leaf from the book of online companies. Do some serious A/B testing about how they structure their websites in order to funnel the consumer towards what they want them to subscribe to, which is or should be, in my opinion, the gigabit offers. So obviously each individual case is going to be different, and we're happy to offer assistance in figuring out how to do it exactly. But the point is that these at least are four elements that I think really need to be addressed if gigabit is going to really pick up. And again, the benefits in terms of margin will be absolutely immediate if they do that.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you very much for bringing your expertise here, Benoit. It was very interesting, very useful. I see a question popping up in the question list. So I will. The question is: do you agree that fiber optics offers should have a price lower than 5G at parity of speed and service, considering that fiber optics consumes much lower energy than 5G?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when you say it like that, there's an assumption that every offer should perfectly reflect costs. In the real world, that's not how it works, right? Sure, a Louis Vuitton handbag costs more to produce than the average leather handbag, but it doesn't cost 20 times more to produce. So, how you position your pricing is not solely a cost-based decision. So the real question to me should be, are you offering both? If you're offering both, then you need to adjust your pricing so that you get the customers where you want them. If you want them to have both 5G and fiber, then you need to think about the two prices in relation to each other, maybe even group the offers so that they can buy both at a discount. But if your competitors are offering 5G, then yeah, you definitely want to be below that price. And then if you're the mobile operator offering 5G, you want to be lower than your fiber offer. So it's hard to have a hard and fast rule. It's really about market circumstances. Now, if the question is it cheaper to run a fiber broadband offer at equivalent speed to a 5G mobile broadband offer, in terms of OPEX, I think there's no doubt that it is. The huge benefit there of fiber is that it's a very flat cost structure. There's very few variable costs, whereas energy and spectrum and all of that creates actually a larger variable cost basis on the mobile side.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and I would also add to that mobile type of offerings or fixed offerings are having some conceptual difference as well, because mostly unlimited in fixed type of where you have more, let's say, download volume limits in more mobile type of usage. We'll see how that evolves, of course, but there are also some elements that are different when you talk about the connectivity model or concept for fixed or for mobile as such.
Yeah, and also it's mobile. I mean, that's the benefit you're paying for as well, is that you get it everywhere.
Yes, indeed. But it's mostly done up to, of course, yeah, with gigabit you also have up to, but speeds are not so much defined in the mobile world than in the fixed world. Okay, and next question. We see in many markets FTTH services sold at the doorstep as the main sales channel. Do you see consistent data to show how gigabit services are primarily purchased? Do you have an insight on that, Benoit?
So it's true that in early stages of market deployment, doorstep sales have proven to be very effective. It's also a very expensive channel. My impression is that once a market reaches maturity, that no longer is the primary sales channel. Basically, once you get to a critical mass of coverage, which means you can start to do national advertising, whether it's above the line or below the line, doesn't really matter. Then you want customers to come to you, either calling you or going on the website. And as soon as you can guarantee to them that they can actually get the fiber if the house is not already connected, then that's a much more efficient channel. So it's really a question of maturity. In you know, like typically in the Netherlands 10 years ago, yes, a lot of those sales were done door to door. I don't think it's the case anymore. And here in France, similarly, I don't think there's anyone doing door to door sales anymore. So it's really down to you know, where you are in the coverage and advertising story.
Yeah, understand. By the way, it was Simon Rosas who was asking that question. I have also Mr. Rui Duarte who asks for the copy of the slides, and of course they will be made available, so that's not a problem. I don't see for the moment.
Well, in fact, if I may, we are also distributing the full report. So it's not just the slides that are going to be available. There's a what is it, 12-page report that goes in a lot more detail on the numbers, on all kinds of specifics. So you know, make sure you download that as well, because it complements what we've been discussing here very well.
Exactly. We have some spare time for some additional questions, I think. So we talked about the wholesale and retail models. So why is it more in the interest of the wholesaler to encourage higher speed, for instance, according to you, Benoit?
Well, I mean, first of all, wholesale models don't rely on a lot of like additional services, right? Maybe you can have various SLA options or that kind of stuff, but essentially all of the value creation that is going to happen in the market is going to happen above your network, not within your network. This is, I mean, this is something that's being discussed a lot with, you know, things like slicing, et cetera, down the line, that there might actually be some opportunities to deliver a multiplicity of services beyond broadband through a wholesale channel, but it's not the reality of the market today. So I think if you're a wholesaler, your core focus is on making sure that the end user, which you have no direct relationship with, is not going to shift to another network, right? So you want him to have the best possible broadband, because that's what's going to keep him on the broadband. Essentially, your business model is predicated on your number of end users only going up, never going down. So what you want is someone who's happy, and if they're not happy, they're going to go to another provider on the same network. That's your business model sorted, right? So I think introducing complexity in your wholesale offers is not in your interest for that very reason, right? You want the simplest, smoothest, easiest relationship that you can set up. And like segmenting like crazy introduces a lot of complexity in the systems, in the relationship, in the consumer choice. So I don't think really that it's in your interest.
No.
Ideally, you would want all of the consumers to be on gigabit already today, because they would be getting a better experience, and the marginal benefit that you would be getting from selling higher tiers, I don't think is worth as much as the guarantee that they're not moving and that they're happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. I have another question from Paul Thompson, who wants to go back to the value-added services we discussed. So, which do you see driving the need for higher speeds? Because even 4K Netflix is sub 50 megabits per second. Is it virtual reality? Is it immersive video conferencing? Is it these kind of, or are there other ones you see there popping up?
So, for the last 10 years now, at least, I've been saying that there is no killer app. Remember 10 years ago, everybody was talking about killer apps. We don't use this expression anymore. And I think everyone's kind of realized that it's in many ways the wrong way of looking at the world. The core of my thought process on this is essentially goes in two directions, right? Direction number one is speed sells. So consumers, I mean, they have no way of estimating what they need before they have the broadband installed, right? So this is why when the first lockdown came in, operators were getting flooded by calls of people saying, well, my broadband is too bad for what I needed now, right? So in that sense, the killer app was for people in the home using broadband simultaneously. It wasn't any particular thing that they were doing. It was just that they were all pulling on the same resource at the same time. And in actual fact, just to be clear, the saturation was not happening in the access. It was happening in the aggregation, because this is where dimensioning, with all the statistical multiplexing going on, et cetera, the dimensioning was simply insufficient. And that's why when we did a study a couple of years ago on the first lockdowns to try and estimate what happened exactly. And for sure, the first 2 or 3 weeks, you saw a clear degradation in performance. But within 3 weeks, it had been fixed, because these were aggregation links that needed more capacity. And that's very easy for an operator to upgrade. So the point is that, that drove demand for higher speeds, because upfront people didn't realize they needed it. The minute they were in a different circumstance, they needed it. And I don't think they'll be going back, because they've been through this experience now. But having said that, from a marketing standpoint, we know that speed sells, provided that the revenue uplift that you're expecting from it isn't too important. So this is back to the premium point that we were highlighting. I am absolutely convinced that if your gigabit offer is 20% more expensive than your 100 meg offer, and you do a concerted marketing effort to get people to upsell, you'll get great success on the upsell. So that's one aspect, right? So it's really independent of what people are doing with it to a certain extent. Now, of course, we are anticipating down the line some applications that will require either very high capacity or very low latency, or both. So, VR, etc., for sure. Now, the question mark that I have is, do we anticipate that 50% of households are going to have VR sets within 5 years? I don't see it. I may be wrong, and it'd be great for vendors and application providers if I was wrong, but I just don't see it. So you don't build your network strategy on the basis of a niche market. You build it on the basis of what most consumers are going to want to buy, which is a different thing than what they need, right? Remember, we don't need $1,200 handsets. We would be doing 95% of what we're doing with $300 handsets. But people are buying $1,200 handsets because they want to. So from a marketing standpoint, I don't think building the network strategy on an understanding of what the need is where you need to be. You need to look at what your internal needs are. Where are you saturating? And I know from having talked to a lot of operators that they see their PON saturating in some areas. And this is what drives the adoption of XGS-PON. Once you have XGS-PON, then marketing can take over and say, okay, what should I sell? 2 gig, 5 gig, whatever, and how do I sell it? But there's not, I think, 8K TV, it'll come, but all of these things will actually, the ecosystem will evolve afterwards, not before, I suppose is what I'm saying. So yeah. I think the key drivers are going to happen once the infrastructure is at least partly in place. And actually, this allows me to touch upon a point that a lot of people dismiss, but I think is important. Remember how when we were all on dial-up, and then a few privileged people started migrating to DSL, and they were saying, oh my God, everything is so fast. And then within a few years, everything was not so fast anymore, and dial-up was unusable. That's because the entire online ecosystem adjusted to, hey, everybody's got DSL now. And gradually, slowly, the same thing is happening with every website out there now, right? The basic assumption is that you have fiber speeds at least 100 meg, if not more. And so your online experience, if you're still on DSL today, or if you're on a 50 meg package, your online experience is now degrading, just like dial-up was degrading 20 years ago. The shift is more gradual, but it's still happening. And so I think as service providers, well, I'm not a service provider. Service providers need to realize that part of the evolution of their own offers is also following that trend. So there's a very interesting example with Chorus in New Zealand, for example. Last December, they basically increased the speeds of their basic packages without charging more, just because they need to adjust to the fact that people are now using these basic packages differently. And so the purpose is not an upsell, it's just to deliver a service that allows people to do what they wanted to do with it, because they don't feel like their use has changed that much, but the need from a network standpoint did. And so I think that's very smart thinking. This is how you keep your customers as well.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned the network. And as a last question, I would like to say, we talk about more and more speed for consumers. We talk about gigabit monetization, gigabit speed. But that additional capacity that you have then in the network, does that not compromise, if you talk about these other services or other segments for business or for mobile transport or whatever on your fiber infrastructure?
So what's really interesting, and this is, we're really at the very beginning of that trend, right? But what's really interesting is that as these higher speed network technologies are being implemented, XGS-PON, 25G, also in parallel, we see the virtualization of the network becoming more and more of a reality. And that opens up a very important capability when it comes to fixed networks, which is fixed network slicing. Slicing is a term that's used a lot in the mobile space, but actually in the fixed space, it has very clear and practical applications in order to basically shell, I suppose could be a word, or tunnel specific traffics within the network to shelter them from excessive usage. So if you are using your XGS-PON network for mobile backhaul, you can use slicing to ensure that that mobile backhaul will not be affected by anything else that happens on the network. And this is a way to effectively replicate multiple physical networks without having to deploy multiple physical networks. And so the way that I see this is that this is the only way that this one network vision can actually become a reality, because we still need, from a logical standpoint, to be able to separate the business market from the mobile backhaul or mobile front haul and from the residential customers. And slicing is actually the way to do that. And it's interesting, you know, these trends in technology, because a few years ago, like, everybody was talking about slicing. Now it's like nobody's talking about it anymore, but it's still there, it's still happening, and it really is a very important step that you know, we need to keep in mind, and operators need to put a lot of thought process into, because the big benefit of this one network vision is going to be the ability to switch off the copper, to switch off the dedicated fiber links to mobile masts. Once you can really manage this as a single network, I mean, some operators are managing effectively 4 or 5 networks in parallel. The OPEX and energy cost of that, not to mention the sustainability angle, it's absurd. We absolutely need to have that as a priority agenda for operators.
Absolutely. And with that as an excellent closing, I would like to close this session. I don't see any additional questions anymore.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say thanks to everyone who attended, and obviously feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Don't forget to download the white paper, and thanks to you, Eric, and to the council for hosting this.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.